Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of a class from our 2022 Elul Learning Series.
Hello there. Good evening. It's going to be a deep dive into philosophy tonight, so I hope you're awake for that. Okay. When we talk about the themes of the high holidays, thinking about, remember the title for this general series is Back to the Basics. So what I thought I would do is literally go back to the basics in terms of how the Jewish tradition understands who we are as human beings. And in order to, because Jews tend to think that the whole world is Jewish, and that at least if they're not Jewish, they at least think the same way that Jews do. What I'm going to do is show you some other ways in which people understand the human being and human faults. And then I'm going to talk about the Jewish tradition so that you can see that it really is a distinctive tradition in terms of how we understand moral life and what happens when we mess up, when we do something wrong. So, let's take, I'm going to take, two secular, philosophical traditions, just to give you a sense of that. And then we'll look at Christianity and then we'll look at Judaism. So let's start with, Thomas Hobbes. This one's going to bring some of you back to your college days, but that's okay. If you remember, Thomas Hobbes believes, he's a 17th century British philosopher, believes that the human being, the characteristic, the central characteristic of the human being is a will to power. And that therefore, in a state of nature, everybody would be trying to basically take advantage of everybody else, and maybe even at the expense of taking the other people's lives. And so life in a state of nature is, as they put it, nasty, brutish, and short. Right? Because if you are in a state of nature, then you are always in fear of what other people are going to do to you. And even somebody who is very powerful, let's say, for some reason, ultimately has to sleep. And so even people who are very powerful are vulnerable. And it's for that reason that human beings decide to create a civil society, the Leviathan, as he calls it, in which you give up some of your rights in a state of nature in order to be able to live in a civil society that will at least protect you. And so consequently, when you have done that, when you have left the state of nature and you have agreed to give up some of your rights, like stealing from people, killing, because the other thing is that in a state of nature, as he puts it, there's no productivity because nobody would bother producing anything because it could be stolen from you the next day. There's also no agriculture. None of that, nothing that requires sustained work would continue to exist in a state of nature, because of the fact that, it's not secured. And you would never be able to get the advantages of the work that you put into whatever it is that you were doing. So in the civil society, you have the duty, in order to maintain the civil society, to obey whatever the laws are. And if you violate the laws, then you have to accept your punishment, right? It's a very simple legal structure, where you gain the protection of the civil society, but on condition that you obey its laws. And if you disobey its laws, you have to, you have to accept whatever punishment they give you, with one exception, namely, if the society wants to take your life. Because the whole point of giving up your rights was to protect your existence. But if the society is going to execute you, then what do you think Hobbes would tell you to do? Anybody? Just unmute yourself.
You'd fight for your life.
Yeah, basically run away. That's right. That's right. Do whatever you need in order to stay alive. All right. But that's the one exception. For Hobbes, you simply have to take whatever punishment you get for violating whatever the laws are, because the whole point of the social contract was that you had to obey the laws in order to secure your own right, your own existence, and your own property. And therefore, if you violate those laws, you have to take whatever punishment it is. A very different understanding of who we are is John Locke, who is also writing in the 17th century, also a Brit, but has a very different understanding of the human being. The human being is rational. And because the human being is rational, people recognize that you can't do everything on your own. So you need to be able to, the reason why you create society is so that you can have roads and bridges, and you can have public education and culture and so on down the line, right? Because there are all kinds of things that you cannot do on your own, and you realize that if you're a rational human being. So, it is Locke who first wrote, and Jefferson, 100 years later, cribbed this from Locke. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and Jefferson said the pursuit of happiness. Locke had said life, liberty, and property. All right? So we are individuals with rights, endowed by our Creator. Now notice, by the way, both Locke and Jefferson, along with all the rest of the founding fathers, were deists. They did not believe in a personal God. They believed in a creative force. So we're endowed by our Creator. He wanted to make sure that you didn't think for a moment that Jefferson, was a theist, right? That he believed in a personal God. We're endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. To secure these rights, governments are instituted by men. That's the next line in the Declaration of Independence, right? So the reason why you have to obey the law is because it secures your rights, and it's and the law itself is a product of your own device, because back in high school many, many years ago, I had a terrific teacher for U.S. history, and she spent a third of the first semester on the U.S. Constitution, and then we were going to have this big test on the U.S. Constitution, and she told us what the first question was going to be and what the first answer was going to be. The first question was, who wrote the Constitution? And if you said Jefferson and Madison, that was wrong. Who wrote the Constitution? We, the people. Now, I have to tell you, I don't remember many lesson plans from high school, but that clearly made an impression on me, right? Because it's just so counterintuitive, but at the same time, it really made the point that the reason why the law is authoritative is because it is of our own making as a community, and we come together as a community for the rational reasons of trying to cooperate with each other on things that we could not possibly do on our own. So if you make a mistake or if you violate the law, the word sin is usually used in religious context. So I'll say, if you're a criminal in some way, right, if you violate the law, then what you need to do is, again, accept whatever the penalty is. However, because you are rational just as much as everybody else, you get to do more of what Rick was just talking about. You get to argue your case much more carefully, right? Because presumably the people who are judging you are also rational human beings and also very much interested in preserving rights, and therefore the whole regime of the government has to be much more tuned to preserving rights and much less attuned to punishment. Okay? So those are two very different understandings of who the human being is, and then what happens when somebody violates the law. Now let me take Christianity. In Christianity, this goes back to at least Paul in the New Testament, but it gets expanded in in people like Augustine in particular, and then in the 4th century and early 5th century, and then even more so by people like Calvin and Luther in the 17th century, right? In the 16th century, sorry. I, in the Christian understanding of things, I am a sinner by birth. I inherit original sin, right? So original sin means that I'm a sinner in my origins, in my DNA, as it were. And to add insult to injury, I have no ability to overcome my sinfulness. The way that Paul puts it in the New Testament is there's no salvation by works. You can't do anything in order to overcome your sinfulness. So the only thing that will save you from your sinfulness is belief in a supernatural intercessor, namely Jesus, who is God's only begotten Son, whom God sends to die. Jesus dies on the cross for our sins, right? So that we can then be forgiven for the sins that we commit. And this is very thoroughgoing. It's especially in evangelical Christianity, which is, a direct line from Paul to Augustine to Luther, especially Calvin, to contemporary evangelical Christianity. By the way, there's another important line in Christianity that goes in a very different direction, which is through Aquinas, who was very much influenced by Maimonides, through Aquinas, and then through some of the more recent Catholic teachings about human beings and all of that. So what I'm talking about is really evangelical Christianity. What you are a sinner, and the only way that you can be forgiven for your sins is if you believe in Jesus. Okay? So I once was, for my many sins, in front of 5,000 evangelical Christians at the San Diego Convention Center to debate whether Jesus rose from the dead. Clearly, I have major sins here. Okay, now, and of course, all of the proof texts for Jesus rising from the dead were from the New Testament. So I pointed that out to the audience, right? But I said, I really don't care whether you believe whether Jesus rose from the dead, as long as you don't try to convert us. That's the real reason why I was there, right? To say that you need to understand that, as the Catholic tradition has said, starting with Vatican II, is that this comes from Paul. It's Paul already in the New Testament, right? God never forgoes his covenants, and God already made a covenant with the Jewish people before God made a covenant with the Gentiles, right? And they became Christians. So you should respect that and not try to convert us. That's the real reason why I was there. But the first question I was asked, when it was question and answer, was, do Jews believe in forgiveness? And I said, yes, Jews believe in forgiveness, but it has to be earned. And you heard 5,000 evangelical Christians go, right? Because that completely undermines the reason why they're Christian, right? The whole point of evangelical Christianity is to be forgiven for your sins even before you do them. And it's part of the lure of evangelical Christianity, part of the attraction, part of the reason why it's very popular in prison environments, right? Because because basically you accept Jesus as your savior, and then all of a sudden you have a clean slate, right? Whereas what we say is very demanding, as you know, in regard to the process of tshuva. We'll get there, okay? But I am a sinner by birth. I cannot do anything in order to overcome that except to believe in a supernatural intercessor who will redeem me from my sins. Now, that doesn't mean that I should sin at will, right? Because the other side of the Christian story is that Jesus does very nice things in his life. He helps the poor. He tries to cure the sick and all of that, right? So that's another side of Christianity. So that's where you get things like Catholic social services and Lutheran hospitals and Lutheran social services and so on down the line, right? Where you get the notion of a a Christian lady or gentleman, right, who is really interested in following the model of Jesus. Now, of course, when I talk, I do a lot of interfaith work. When I talk to Christians, I say, I want to point out to you that means following the model of a Jew, right? Because Jesus was Jewish, right? But that's okay. I'm just playing with them and having some fun with them. But I want to remind them that Jesus was a Jew, and to the extent that he was really interested in this life and interested in trying to make it better for everybody, that's the Jew in him, right? And that's part of that's the Jewish part of whatever the Christian tradition is that Christians embrace. So that's the other side of it, right? So I am, if I'm a Christian, I am a sinner by birth, but I also I'm supposed to be a follower of Jesus and try to embody in my life the kinds of things that Jesus did in his life for other people. Okay? The Jewish tradition is unlike Hobbes and unlike Locke and unlike Christianity. There are two basic pieces to the way that the Jewish tradition understands us. One is that we were created in the image of God. That you get already in the very opening chapters of Genesis, right? Now, of course, what does it mean to be created in the image of God? Not surprisingly, Jews disagree about that, okay? But, I mean, what I would say, and this is just Elliot Dorff talking, is that I think the pshat, the simple meaning of the term, in the context of the Torah itself, comes out of the Garden of Eden story, right? Where Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden. They eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, right? So they know what right and wrong, good and bad are, and they're able to act on that knowledge. But they get kicked out of the Garden of Eden lest they eat of the fruit of eternal life and therefore become like gods. Right? That's what the Torah says there. So being like God means that you know the difference between right and wrong, and you live forever. I mean, none of us lives forever, but we do know the difference between right and wrong, and I think that's what the Torah means by saying that we were created in the image of God. Maimonides, typical rationalist, thinks that the image of God in us is our ability to reason discursively, right? Our ability to make arguments and to respond to each other in intellectual terms, right? Others within the tradition thinks that the image of God within us is that we are spiritual. We are not just, we're not just another form of animal life, but God breathes life into us. And so it's God that breathes life into us. And so consequently, there's a piece of God in us that we're able to try to relate to God in that way. Others, like the Martin Buber, would say that what is the spirit of God, the image of God in us, is that we are able to relate to human beings in I-thou relationships and not just in I-it relationships. That is, we are able to interact with other human beings in ways that celebrate, that recognize and respect and even celebrate their inherent worth as human beings, right? There's a Talmudic passage which says that the image of God in us is the fact that we stand upright rather than walking on all fours. That's probably not one you would have thought of, but anyway, that's yet another interpretation of it. But if I go to the original one, which I think really is the original one, one part of us that is the image of God in us is that we have the knowledge of right, wrong, good, and bad, and we have the ability to act on that. And another piece of it, and this also is in the Torah itself, this is in Deuteronomy chapter 21, when somebody commits a capital crime and is being hanged, then you have to take the body down before nightfall, because a hanging body, in other words, a dead body, is kikelat Elohimi. It's a curse of God. So clearly, even somebody who has committed a capital crime, nevertheless has the image of God within that person. That doesn't mean that you should either approve of or even condone whatever the person did to warrant capital punishment. But it does mean that even the worst of the worst of us are nevertheless embody a certain spark of the divine that has to be taken into account even in terms of the death penalty, which leads, by the way, to a whole other thing about Judaism and the death penalty, but that's probably for another time, okay? But the point is that the Jewish tradition, the rabbis didn't like the death penalty at all. And even though there are 36 different offenses in the Torah that lead to the death penalty, by the time you get to the rabbis say a Jewish court that condemns one person to death in 7 years is a bloody court. Another edition of that once in 70 years. And Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon say that if they were in the court, there would never be a capital sentence. So if you ever thought that the rabbis are living the same religion as the Torah, think again. Okay, our tradition is very much a developing tradition. But the point is that in that line in Deuteronomy, you can see that the image of God within us is even in those people who clearly do not distinguish between right and wrong appropriately and do not act appropriately, because if they were subject to the death penalty, they clearly did not act appropriately. And nevertheless, there is a kind of inherent worth in every human being. Again, that doesn't mean you need to like everybody. It certainly doesn't mean you have to condone what everybody does, right? But there is a kind of inherent worth in every human being that this doctrine announces. Okay? The other part of the Jewish understanding of who we are begins in Genesis chapter 8. Ki lev ben Adam ramin urav. The heart of the human being is bad from his youth. And the rabbis say, well, actually, there is a Yetzer Hara and a Yetzer Hatov. We have an inclination to do bad and an inclination to do good, and those are correct translations of those terms, Yetzer Hara and Yetzer Hatov. But you have to be very careful here, because the rabbis also tell a story that at one point, all the righteous people of the world asked God to take away the Yetzer Hara, to take away the evil inclination. And then chickens did not lay eggs, people did not build houses, they did not get married, did not have children. Now those are all good things, right? So the Yetzer Hara really is not necessarily the bad in us, it's the self-serving in us, as opposed to the Yetzer Hatov, which is the altruistic inclination in us. And the rabbis say, right, that we are born with both of them, but the Yetzer Hara is immediately effective from the moment of birth. All you have to do is look at an infant and you'll know what we're talking about. It's me. As a matter of fact, we have very good evidence psychologically that infants don't even recognize that mom and dad are separate from themselves until about 3 or 4 months after birth, right? They're just simply extensions of themselves that are there to do the infant's bidding, right? And it takes 13 years, the rabbis say, for the Yetzer Hatov, the altruistic instinct, to be fully developed. Hence, bar and bat mitzvah at 13. And of course, this happens developmentally. It happens over time, that children learn, what they're supposed to do and what they're not supposed to do. I don't know if you've ever read Robert Fulgram's book, Whatever I Needed to Learn, I Learned in Kindergarten. Whatever I needed to know, I learned in kindergarten. If you've never read it, you should read it. First of all, it's very funny, but he's got a list of about 250 things that you learn in kindergarten. Like, do not hit other people, right? You need to cooperate. You need to be responsible. And so on down the line, right? A whole series of things he learned in kindergarten, okay? And then from the time of 13 on, we human beings are a balancing act between our self-serving instinct and our altruistic instinct. And what we need to do is we need to do that kind of balancing act. And the rabbis recognize, why is the self-serving instinct called the Yetzer Hara, the evil instinct? Because we're more likely to cause harm to other people if we're worried about ourselves. And in contrast, if we're worried about other people, we're more likely to do good things. That said, the rabbis recognize that too much of the Yetzer HaTov, of the altruistic instinct, is not good either. And they tell the story of a man who was so altruistic that whenever he had money, he would give it away. So on the day of his daughter's wedding, the court had to send emissaries of the court to his home to accompany him to the wedding for fear that he would give away his daughter's dowry on the way to the wedding, right? You can be too altruistic. And I actually know of a couple, I'm sure there are others, but I know of a couple who actually got divorced over this issue. The man was completely altruistic, completely giving. And the woman felt that she could never catch up, right? It was a losing game. There was no balance here. There was no reciprocity. And she simply couldn't stand that. And because, marriage is a cooperative venture, for that matter, friendships are cooperative ventures, and friendships or marriages that are very one-sided often do not last very long, unless that just happens to be part of the dynamic that was from day one and everybody accepts it. So, I mean, I'm thinking of one friend. I have yet to, I don't remember in all these years when he called me. I have to call him, right? It's just the nature of the game. And if I want to have this friendship, I've just got to be aware of that, right? But in the vast majority of friendships, it's mutual, right? And each member of each one of the friends, takes on some responsibility for maintaining the friendship and for cultivating it. And all the more so if you're talking about spousal relationships, or even parent-child relationships, right, over time, right, that there needs to be mutuality there. There needs to be that kind of mutual, contribution to the relationship. So similarly, so the way that the Jewish tradition understands us is that once we are 13 or above, we have both a Yetzer Hara and a Yetzer HaTov, and we need to cultivate both, and we need to balance them. And the rabbis tell the story of two men, you probably have heard this, who are in a desert, and they find that they only have enough water for one of them to make it back to civilization. And so the question is, who gets the water, right? And the ultimate answer is by Rabbi Akiva, whoever owns the water bottle gets the water. Because on the one hand, you're not allowed to commit suicide any more than you're allowed to commit murder. You're not allowed to steal. The one who does not own the bottle of water is not allowed to steal it, because that would be murder under these circumstances. On the other hand, the one who owns it is not allowed to give it away or even share it, at least, because by hypothesis, there's not enough for both of them to make it back to civilization, and you're not allowed to commit suicide either. So chayacha kodmin, your life comes first. And hence what you get, it's very much, by the way, like what you were told on airplanes, right? If the air masks come down, put the air mask on your face first and then help others. Because if you're not okay, you can't help anybody else. So in the same sort of a way, your life comes first, but once you are able to help yourself and then your immediate family, it's concentric circles. And then your local Jewish community, then the larger Jewish community, and then the non-Jewish community. And the fact that the rabbis in the 2nd century, this is in a Tosefta, say that we Jews have an obligation to help the poor of the non-Jewish community, the sick of the non-Jewish community, to help people bury their dead if they're not Jewish, and help them mourn, is really remarkable, because I can guarantee you that the Romans at the time were not interested in helping the Jews of the time in those ways, right? So the fact that the Jewish community says that once you secure the welfare of individuals and then families and local Jewish community, the larger Jewish community, that we have an obligation to the general community, and this goes from the 2nd century on. This is really, I think, rather remarkable if you're looking at it historically, and something we should be very proud of. Okay? So we have this balancing act. Now, what happens when you mess up? First of all, do you mess up a lot? You bet you do. At least the liturgy assumes so, because 3 times a day in the Amidah we say, Slach lanu avinu ki chatanu. Forgive us, our Father, for we have sinned. Right? Not just the high holidays. 3 times a day during the weekdays, right? That we say that. Right? And and why is that? Well, I'm going to tell you another story. For 16 years, I was the rabbi in residence at Camp Ramah in Ojai. And there was one summer in which there were two bunks of 12-year-old boys who, from day one, were just at each other. I don't know why, just at each other. Okay? So the counselors tried to do what they could do, and were not successful. The Rosh Edah, the division head, tried to do what he could do for that. The camp psychologist was there. So, as the last resort, they called the rabbi. So I handed out Sidurim. I handed out prayer books. And you could see that there are two bunks of 12 boys, of 12-year-old boys each. So 24 12-year-olds in front of me. Okay? And you could see their eyes roll, right? Okay. 12-year-olds are not good at hiding their feelings, right? There's the rabbi doing his thing again. All right. So I had them open. I said that the Amidah, which we say 3 times a day, has 3 blessings at the beginning and 3 at the end. The 3 blessings at the beginning basically identify who the characters are. We are blessed as God, who is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, the God that we've known for generations. That's the first bracha. Second, God is Magen Abraham, God is the shield of Abraham, right? Second bracha, God is powerful, even to the point of Mechayeh HaMeitim, of reviving the dead. And third, God is even holy. God is WHOLLY, wholly different from us. Okay? That's the first 3 blessings. So it basically identifies the characters in the novel. So then, what's the first blessing after that? You grant to us knowledge and you give us understanding. May you be gracious to give us de'ah, that's factual knowledge, the stuff that you'd like to have on Jeopardy. Okay? Bina, bet yud nun, bain means between. Bina is analytic knowledge, the ability to distinguish one thing from another. Remember Sesame Street, one of these things is not like the other. One of these things just doesn't belong. That's analytic knowledge. That's Bina. The Haskel, Seichel, is experiential knowledge, wisdom, right? Give us wisdom. So that's the first. It's almost Cartesian. Descartes, remember, says that. How do you know what is the basis of all your knowledge? I think, therefore I am. At least I understand that I have knowledge. And the first paragraph of the middle section of the Amidah is almost that, right? We thank God for being aware. So what are we aware of? The very next sentence of the paragraph is Hashivenu avinu l'Toratecha. Bring us back to your Torah. So the first thing that we're aware of is that we mess up. And then the third paragraph is Slach lanu avinu ki katanu. Forgive us for we have sinned. So I said to these boys, why is it that, if you think that somebody has wronged you, that you do not want to forgive them? And, and they were very forthcoming, right? Can you tell me some of the answers that you think they might have given? Why would they not want to forgive?
It's powerful.
Pardon
me? Anger and not forgiving. It's powerful.
That's right. They're just angry. They've been wronged and they're angry. They're not in a forgiving mood. Why else do they not want to forgive?
Because they think the one who feels wrong feels they need something first that is maybe before the other one is more than the other one's willing to give.
That's right. That whoever did something wrong has to warrant forgiveness, has to do something to make forgiveness justifiable. Good. What's another reason they don't like to forgive?
Makes them look weak.
Yes, it makes them look weak. It's that they're losing the moral high road, as it were, right? And it makes them look weak. What's another reason they don't want to forgive?
Because denial is not just a river in Egypt. They want to just move on and put it behind them.
No, that would be a reason to forgive. But the reason that they don't want to forgive is that they feel
they like holding on to the anger.
Yes, right. And they feel vulnerable. And they don't trust this person or these people did them wrong in the past. And how do they know they're not going to do them wrong again? right? So they're not interested in making life whole with these people, right? They don't want to. All right. So I said, okay. So now remember the liturgy says, Hashivenu avinu l'Toratecha, bring us back to your Torah and then forgive us. So how can we ask God to forgive us if we never forgive? So why would you ever, given all of these reasons not to forgive, why would you ever forgive? And one boy said, because otherwise you won't have any friends. Right? And I thought he was very astute, actually. Because, I mean, he recognized that we all mess up, right? And that at some point or another, you've got to, you have to allow forgiveness to happen if you want to maintain the relationship. Now, that though, but then the question is, well, what warrants forgiveness, right? And that is this whole process of tshuva, that we have for individuals and also for communities. Basically, Maimonides is the one that really spells it out most in his laws of tshuva, of tshuva. But basically, it is, first of all, you have to acknowledge that you did something wrong. Then you have to apologize for it. You have to show remorse, right? Then third, you have to compensate to whatever extent you can. And then, sometimes the way I put it is, Judaism is a put up or shut up religion, right? Then the next time the same thing happens, you have to act differently. And you haven't done full tshuva until you have acted differently when the same temptations occur. Okay? So that's sort of the core of the tshuva process. And so I asked them, what would it take for whatever you think the other bunk did wrong? First of all, tell me what you think the other bunk did wrong. So they both articulated their grievances, right? So then I said, okay, well, what would it take for bunk one to forgive bunk two and bunk two to forgive bunk one, right? And we worked out a contract, okay, about how that's going to happen. Now I can't say that they became best friends by the end of the summer, but at least they were civil to each other, right? So, I mean, to a certain extent, this actually worked. Now, the same sort of thing is true on a communal level. I've been part of the priest-rabbi dialogue since it first began in 1973, sponsored by the Archdiocese of Los Angeles and the Board of Rabbis of Southern California, and I've co-chaired it now for the last 20 years or so. It's a group of about 10 priests and rabbis who meet together once a month, and we did a number of educational documents for synagogues and churches for about 20 or 30 years, and now we're doing some learning ourselves about, on a clergy level about the others tradition in a variety of different ways, maybe to create some educational materials for clergy about the other tradition. So at one point in the 90s, so the priest-rabbi dialogue had been going for about 20 years now. By then, the priest asked the rabbis, what would it take for the Jewish community to forgive the Catholic community for what it did and did not do during the Second World War? Now, the first thing that we recognized is that everybody around the table either was not born during the Second World War or was an infant. I mean, I was born in 1943. So I was 2 years old by the time the war was over, right? Barely, not even 2 years old, because it ended 2 weeks before I was born. Anyway, before my second birthday. So the first question is, how can people who live in another generation speak for people who suffered in an earlier generation, even if they're part of the same community, right? And the second thing that became clear was that you had to distinguish among three things. One is pardon, one is forgiveness, and one is reconciliation. Okay? Pardon, sometimes they're used interchangeably. So if you bump into somebody in the street and say, pardon me, or forgive me, or excuse me, or something, that's all synonymous. But if you're using these terms in very specific terms, a governor issues a pardon. What that means is that the offense still exists, but the punishment stops. Okay? So that's a pardon. Reconciliation is that you decided to become, to continue to be friends, no matter what has happened before. And forgiveness means that you have done something in order to try to warrant the other party, the victimized party, from feeling victimized. Okay, you've done something to try to repair the wrong. Now, sometimes people can do everything in their power to try to repair the wrong, and nevertheless, the other party doesn't want that party to darken his or her doorstep again, right? You see this a lot if you're talking about couples where one of them has cheated on the other, right? Sometimes the party, and by the way, thanks to women's liberation, the statistics now is that women cheat on their husbands as much as men cheat on their wives. But that's a whole other story. But even if the cheating party has done whatever they can to try to say that was a mistake on my part and meant nothing and all of that, sometimes they just cannot reconcile. Sometimes there is no act of forgiveness, but there is reconciliation. For example, Japan has never asked for forgiveness of the United States for bombing Pearl Harbor. And yet, ever since the end of the Second World War, there have been very close relationships between Japan and the United States on all kinds of levels, on military levels, on business levels, on cultural levels, all kinds of stuff, right? So sometimes there can be reconciliation without forgiveness. Sometimes there can be forgiveness. I forgive you, but I just don't want to talk to you again, right? And I don't want to stay married to you again. So sometimes there can be forgiveness without reconciliation. And sometimes there can be pardon without either one of them, right? So you need to make a distinction among those things. So if we were to talk about simply reconciliation, given the fact that the priests around the table were not the ones that acted wrongly during the Second World War, and the rabbis around the table were not the ones who were the immediate victims of the suffering, maybe some of their families were, but they themselves were not, right? So given that, what is possible? And what we talked about is what the Catholic Church has done and what it might still do in order to warrant reconciliation and maybe even forgiveness. And I must say that the Catholic Church has done an awful lot along those lines. Nostra Aetate, the Second Vatican document about the relationship of Catholics to Jews, in which they said, first of all, not all Jews at the time of Jesus, nor any Jews since, are responsible for the death of Jesus. It's a major step. This is 1965, right? Because through the Middle Ages, Jews were some of the reasons why Jews suffered so much is because Christians saw them as Christ killers. And here comes the Second Vatican Council and says, not all Jews at the time of Jesus and no Jews since are responsible for the death of Jesus. Second, that God doesn't renege on any of his covenants. So another widespread Christian doctrine for 2,000 years, namely supersessionism, that the new covenant supersedes and takes the place of the old covenant, and therefore, if Jews are not becoming Christian, they're just either stubborn or blind, right? That goes out the wayside with Vatican II, right? Third, they were interested in friendly relationships friendly dialogues between both laity and clergy among the two religions. That's what led to the priest-rabbi dialogue. In Southern California, there was also a Respect Life Committee of lay people, Jewish and Catholic lay people in the 70s and 80s, right? I don't know if it still exists, but they've done a lot. And then later, John Paul II, who remember grew up in Krakow, Poland, right? Went to Jerusalem and was at the wall and put a prayer in the wall and asked for forgiveness on behalf of the Catholic Church. and that declared anti-Semitism a Catholic sin, and that any Catholic who is anti-Semitic is thereby sinning, right? And he established diplomatic relations with Israel, between the Vatican and Israel. So they've done a lot. It doesn't mean they've done everything, and it certainly doesn't mean that this is all known in the Catholic Church. In 1986, and then again in 1999, I was in Poland teaching Catholic seminarians and seminary professors. And in the second time, and Marlon came with me the second time around, so 96, I think it was. That's right, 89 and 96. And I was in Warsaw, Krakow, and Lublin. And in Krakow, they wanted me to teach seminarians, about 40 or 50 seminarians. And so they wanted me to teach certain things. So I would say a line in English, and Father Marian, about 32 years old or so, lovely guy who somehow or another knew native Polish, but knew English well. So he would translate me into Polish. And then when the questions and answers were, he would translate the Polish into English so that we could have that conversation. And I deliberately left time in the third day that we had together for them to ask me whatever they wanted. So the first young man, I think he's about 20, raised his hand and he said, "Why did the Jews kill Jesus?" So I had to teach. This is a rabbi in Krakow, John Paul's home city, right? I had to teach these Catholic seminarians what their church says about Jews, right? It was wild, is what it was. And Father Marian said to me, "Well, you need to know that you are not only the first rabbi that these people have ever seen, they ever talked to. You're the first Jew they've ever talked to, right? And all they know about Jews is what they hear on Good Friday, right? And the Good Friday liturgy is the Jews say, 'Kill them,' right? So he was in Betom Levav, as the Hebrew says, right? In the purity of his heart, he was just asking, why did you guys kill Jesus, right? And so I had to teach them. They clearly had not had that in their seminary education up to that point. They had clearly not learned what the church itself says about this stuff. And it depends very much upon which diocese you're in, what country you're in, and all of that, as to the degree to which this Vatican doctrine has been taught to priests and nuns, let alone to laity. So you need to, but they've done what they can, at least in many places, to justify at least reconciliation, maybe not forgiveness, at least certainly not the need for forgiveness for people who were not alive at that time, right? And you need to sort of try to figure it out that way. A very different kind of situation is in 1996, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, which is about 70% of America's Lutherans, officially repudiated Luther's anti-Semitic comments. Not a small thing, right? The center of your church, who was a straight anti-Semite in all kinds of ways, right? And now the Evangelical Lutheran Church repudiated what Luther had said about Jews and Judaism, right? And then they created a commission of Lutheran theologians to create a new Lutheran theology about Jews and Judaism, which they did with the help of 6 of us who do Jewish theology. They had us come to Gustavus Adolphus College, which is a Lutheran college about an hour and a half southwest of the Minneapolis airport. And it was 3 days. And one of the 6 of us, Jewish theologians, was supposed to talk about topic number 1 the first morning, and then we were going to use the morning to talk about that, and then the second person in the afternoon, and so on through 3 days. So the first morning, it was Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, whom some of you may know, really smart, really learned guy, and a wonderful person, right? So he gave his talk about whatever the topic was for about an hour. And then the other 5 Jews said, well, it's not quite that way, right? And then we are off and running, doing our thing, right? Why did you interpret this text that way? Why didn't you interpret it this way? What about this text that you didn't remember, that you didn't mention, and all of that, right? And then about an hour later, we looked up, and these Lutheran theologians are absolutely bug-eyed, one of them told me he thought we were going to strangle each other at any moment, right? Because if you are Lutheran, especially if you are Scandinavian Lutheran, you don't argue in public. You stare, you glare, you get an ulcer, but you do not argue in public. So one of the things that we have to teach each other is how you respect someone else, right? In our tradition, you respect somebody by listening carefully to what they say, to the point that you ask questions about it and even argue about it. That's what respecting somebody else means, right? Whereas in their tradition, respecting somebody else means that you let them say whatever they want, and you don't upset them. So I mean, but they created a new Lutheran theology about Jews and Judaism, which is a real important step to warrant forgiveness, right? Now that's not true for the Missouri Synod or the Wisconsin Synod of Lutherans, that they're to the right of the Evangelical Lutheran Church. So that's a whole other story that we still have a lot of work to do with. And similarly, the Presbyterians and a whole variety of others, right? But one of the things that one needs to understand is that when people do things wrong, they don't only do things wrong as individuals, they also do them as communities. And so what you need to talk about is not only the mechanics and the theology behind individual forgiveness and what warrants it, but also the theology and the mechanics behind communal forgiveness. All right, I will do the in the book To Do the Right and the Good, which I wrote. I actually have a chapter on communal forgiveness, and I talk about this issue with the Catholic Church and where it leads to. And in another book I did called Love Your Neighbor and Yourself, I have a chapter on individual forgiveness. So if you're at all interested in that, just email me and I'll give you those titles again. Edorff, EDORFF, at aju.edu. I'm in the Beth Am book also, Edorff, EDORFF, at aju.edu. But let me just repeat the titles. To Do the Right and the Good is the one on social ethics, and that's the one about communal forgiveness, to do the right and the good. And the other is Love Your Neighbor and Yourself, which is on personal ethics. And that one has a chapter which starts with the story about the two bunks of boys, and then goes on into the question of what constitutes individual forgiveness. Okay, let me first of all ask for forgiveness for talking too much, and ask for whatever questions or comments you have. Just unmute yourself and speak up.
Rabbi, may I have two short ones?
Sure.
First is, I just wanted to know if by chance you'd ever seen archaeologist Jody Magnus or heard her explain the resurrection.
I've never heard her, no.
The short version is, and I'm not going to remember the name of the follower, that it was on a Friday. Jesus was from the Galilee, a poor family, but a rich follower in Jerusalem had a rock-cut tomb. And because you don't leave the body on Shabbos overnight, it would be disrespectful to the remains. It was buried in the rock-cut tomb of this wealthy follower, whose name I forget. And then after Shabbos, the Jewish followers came and took the body off to the Galilee. And that's why right. And it works from an archaeological perspective. It works from an understanding of Jewish burial practices, etc. So that's one, the Jody Magnus.
But don't try to convince Christians of that, okay?
I'm just saying. And the other is just to say, I grew up in a part of Pittsburgh. My high school class had over 900 people, most of whom were Eastern European Roman Catholics. And all throughout the 60s and at least my part of the 70s, in a written policy, my public high school took the position that Vatican II was wrong. Yeah. So they would never serve, for example, meat on Fridays, because the 5 Jews and the 1 Serbian Orthodox and the handful of Protestants, it didn't matter that we couldn't eat meat. Not that I was going to eat the meat anyway, but, and the only thing I'm going to add to that, so when it turned out, which I could have guessed, that the Pittsburgh massacre shooter was from my neighborhood and dropped out of my school district, it was not a surprise, because that's what I grew up with, the whole Jews had horns, blah, 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 blah. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, it's Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. It's I grew up in Milwaukee, and at the time there were no Jewish day schools. There are now, but there were not then. And I frankly doubt that my parents would have sent me to one anyway, because in that generation you had to go to public school to be American, right? The idea was to, become American. So I went to the Jewish high school, public high school, which had maybe 10% Jews and 90% non-Jews, right? So I had a number of Christian friends along the way, and I did not have any from the Eastern Church. I had a number of Protestant friends and a number of Catholic friends, Roman Catholic friends, but I only came to know people from the Eastern Church when I was in college, actually, in New York. I went to Columbia, and it's only then. And you're absolutely right. The Eastern churches are, well, there was a reason why they're not part of the Roman Catholic Church, right? They don't recognize the Pope as being authoritative, and they don't recognize any of the Vatican documents as being authoritative, and they are, by and large, much more conservative with a small c, right? Than is even the conservative cardinals and archbishops of the Roman Catholic Church tend to be somewhat more liberal than a lot of the priests and clergy of the Eastern Church. But it varies a lot, because you need to know the Eastern Church is not one phenomenon. There's the Russian Orthodox and the Greek Orthodox and the Ukrainian Orthodox and all kinds of other stuff, right? And they don't get along with each other either. So it's, what can I tell you? Okay. By the way, I told you I've been part of the priest-rabbi dialogue since 1973. Let me tell you one thing I've learned. I used to think that the Catholic Church was really very well organized and really unified behind the Pope. Think again, okay? And especially if you talk about the American Catholics, right? Whom one of my priest friends says the way the Vatican sees American Catholics is the Pope's loyal opposition, right? So, and it's certainly true in regard to the use of birth control. Less about abortion, but certainly in regard to the use of artificial birth control among American Catholics, which the vast majority of them use, at least in our generation. Not so true 2 generations ago, but yes, Larry or Diane.
Yeah, this is going to be me. I'm not quite sure where you're going in terms of where you intended to go in terms of contrasting Jewish and Christian thought. But a couple of things strike me as being perhaps different, and you might want to comment on them. One is, and so you talked about the high holidays. So we tend to think of guilt and acting of forgiveness as being individual actions and not collective. But the vidui and the al-chetz are all done in the plural, and I've heard the explanation for why we do that since for a variety of reasons, but there really isn't, as far as I know, any collective process of recognizing error, sin, and asking for forgiveness. And I don't know if that's any different in the Catholic Church or in Christianity in general. And the second thing I'd like to hear your response on is Rabbi Sachs wrote an awful lot about the distinction between guilt cultures and shame cultures, and guilt cultures basically being things where you're inward, you recognize that you did something wrong, then you try to do something about it, and you can be forgiven, whether it be by the divinely or by people. Whereas in shame cultures, it's externally oriented, and you try to avoid being shamed by others. But if you're shamed by others, there is no mechanism by which, at least that I know of, that you can actually be forgiven. I don't quite know if those two come together at all, or if there are distinctions between Jewish thought and Christian thought, but I thought I'd raise those and ask the question.
Okay, so in the first one, since you mentioned it, let's at least mention one or two reasons why the al-chet is in the plural. One reason is so you don't embarrass other people, right? So that people don't, we say as a group that we ask for forgiveness for a whole series of things, together, so that you don't have to say, I did this, I didn't do that, all of that kind of thing, right? A second reason why it's in the plural is because even for those things that you may not want to admit yourself, the liturgy has you admit them because chances are you did them. And if you look at the list, an awful lot of them are about sins of speech, because the Jewish tradition, this is the other side of it, the Jewish tradition is much more both demanding and much more specific about the ethics of speech than, say, the American legal tradition, which is only interested in avoiding libel and slander. In the Jewish tradition, the ethics of speech is much more demanding and much more specific. That's a whole other talk, and I'll be happy to talk to you about it at some point. But if you look at the list, a lot of it has to do with sins of speech. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And hence, it's probably the case that we all did it at one point or another, whether we recognize it or not. So that's another reason why it's in the plural. The reason why, it is the case that on Yom Kippur, if you look at the sacrifices that are given, during after the Maharaji, before the Maharaji, the temple service, you see that first the high priest brings up a sacrifice for himself, then for his family, then for the whole people Israel. So there is a sort of sense that it is the whole people Israel that has sinned, and that part of this, part of the whole ritual is to try to, that's the Seir Li'azazel also, that we read about on Yom Kippur morning, right? Where the idea is that sinfulness is in some ways done by individuals, in some ways by a community, and one needs to recognize both and try to do what one can to make up for both, and that can be partially ritually done, and partially it has to be done in terms of interpersonal relations and what makes for that, right? And by the way, the process is very well, as I said, spelled out very in an organized way by Rambam. But long before Rambam, you get first of all in the temple service the sin offerings and the guilt offerings and all of that, right? Those were attempts to try to alleviate the burden of sin, right? But you also get, in the Mishnah, maybe in a context that you would not have thought of, in chapter 8 of Bava Kama, it's the laws of personal injury. What happens if I hit you and maybe even cause you some injury? So there are 5 different remedies that are spoken about there. But then toward the end of the chapter, the Mishnah says, and even if, let's say I hit you, even if I pay you the money for all of these remedies, I am not forgiven until I ask for forgiveness. And if I ask for forgiveness, and I've done everything I can to warrant it, and you still do not forgive me, I'm supposed to ask a second time and then a third time. And if you fail to forgive me, then it's your fault for not forgiving me, right? This is toward the end of chapter 8 of the Mishnah in Bava Kama, right? So already in the Mishnah, there's a sort of sense that what the boy said at that time, forgiveness has to be a two-way street, right? You have to be willing to forgive, because otherwise you're not going to have any friends. And it's in society's best interest that people be friends, and that people be willing to forgive each other, in those ways. So, I think there is, there is a lot, both in the Torah itself, but even more so in the rabbinic tradition, about both individual forgiveness and also communal forgiveness. Now, there isn't very much, in terms of communal forgiveness, there's not much of the interpersonal part. Most of that is the sacrifices and things like that, right? But you do get, this Shabbat, we're doing Deuteronomy 20 and 21, which are the laws of war. And, if you're going to wage war, you first of all have to ask for peace before you wage war, right? So there is a sort of sense that that you really do not have a right to wage war against another population unless they have wronged you in some way, right? And there are certain rules about the conduct of war, which got developed much later on. And it's, there's not nearly as much of the interpersonal part of this on the communal level as there is on the individual level, but there is at least some of it. Now, on the other issue, in terms of shame and guilt, there again, one of the 5 remedies in 8 is, in chapter 8 of Bava Kama, is for boshet, for shame. And the Talmud is very sophisticated about that. It's not just the shame that the person who is shamed feels, right? But it also is what happens if the person was sleeping and didn't hear it at all, but family members heard it. And the family members found it as being degrading. Or other members of the community heard it and see it as being a degrading comment. So even then, the perpetrator has to pay for boshet, even if the victim never heard it or never was affected by it, or never really saw it as being shameful or being intended to be shameful. So, a comment like, fatty, fatty, boom, boom. I remember this from my childhood, which clearly was not kind. I'll leave it at that, right? And what does that mean, right? And by the way, kids can be really mean to each other, right? And part of learning what you need to do and what you need not to do is call each other names. And despite the fact, sticks and stones can break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Not true. Names hurt people a lot. And so part of it is, the shame part of this is very much in the Jewish tradition, as is the guilt part of this. That's almost notorious in the Jewish tradition, right? All the jokes about it. I won't go through any of those now, but so I haven't read Rabbi Sax's essay, but the point is that it seems to me that there is both shame and guilt in the Jewish tradition, and there is there's a lot of worry about shaming other people, and there are remedies when you do it, things that you have to do in order to make up for it, and there are by the way, prohibitions against it. The rabbis say that if you are malbin panei chaviro b'rabim, somebody who shames somebody else, but literally means turns that person's face white, it's as if that person murdered the other person. And the same sort of thing that would happen if the person literally murdered the other person and the blood drained from that person's face. So the tradition is really not at all happy about shaming other people, and it's willing to impose certain notions of guilt, but it also recognizes when it's, as my grandmother would say, too, right? Too much.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.